Welcome to our deep dive into the Bible. I was checking out this YouTube video you sent summarizing both the Old and New Testaments, and, well, it looks pretty comprehensive. We're going to try to unearth the most captivating stories, point out some of the plot twists you might not expect, and hopefully we can leave you with something to think about.
It's amazing how much history and drama you find packed into this one book. You've got everything from those early creation myths to epic journeys and beyond. Not only will we explore the events and people that made it so famous, but we'll also try to look for those recurring themes and the impact they've had on history as a whole.
It really is kind of crazy when you think about it. Stories this old, but still so relevant to us today. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. It all begins at the beginning, right, with creation.
Exactly. So the video starts out showing this formless void, like total nothingness. And then, bam, God simply says, "Let there be light," and suddenly the universe explodes into being.
Such a powerful image, right? That jump from nothing to something makes you really consider just how massive creation is. What I find so interesting, though, is how this video shows God almost like a sculptor, carefully forming Adam from the dust of the ground.
It really gives you a sense of God's human-like qualities in this version of the story. And then it's not enough for Adam to be alone, so God literally takes a rib from Adam to create Eve.
Almost like God realizes something's missing, right? Like
Right.
companionship is a necessary part of existence. I mean, even God needs someone to hang out with. But then things get a little rocky with the arrival of the serpent, that whole Garden of Eden situation. This video really focuses on how that serpent is so sneaky, manipulating Eve, using her desire for knowledge to get her to eat the forbidden fruit.
It's classic temptation, right? Playing on human weakness, exploiting our desire for more. Of course, Adam ends up following Eve's lead and, well, paradise lost.
Like a domino effect. One decision leads to a whole bunch of consequences. Speaking of consequences, the next story, Cain and Abel, it's pretty intense.
Oh, for sure. It's the first murder in the Bible, and really about so much more than just the act itself. It shows just how destructive jealousy can be, how it leads to violence. And that image of Abel's blood crying out to God from the ground. Well, it's a pretty haunting reminder that actions have a lasting impact. Makes you think, what blood is crying out today because of all the conflicts and injustices we see?
It's a pretty sobering thought. And it seems like humanity didn't learn very much from that first murder. Because if we fast forward to Noah's Ark, the world is just totally corrupt, wicked. So God decides to reset everything with a flood, but he spares Noah and his family because, well, Noah followed God's instructions.
I think Noah's story is one of the most vivid in the Bible. This image of this massive ark being built, all the animals parading in two by two, the water rising higher and higher. I mean, it's a story that captures your imagination for sure. Makes you think about the power of nature, but also about God's mercy, his desire to preserve life.
Totally. The video does such a great job of showing just how huge the flood was. And speaking of massive projects, it goes on to the Tower of Babel.
Right. So all of humanity is united by one language, and they decide to build this huge tower to reach heaven. What's really fascinating is how the video presents it almost like a cautionary tale,
Right.
about pride and the dangers of unified ambition. Because when God confuses their language and scatters humanity, it prevents them from completing what could have been a pretty arrogant goal.
It's a story that I think about a lot, Look around today. We have so many different languages and cultures and beliefs. It's possible that this diversity we see comes from that ancient desire to reach for something beyond ourselves. What do you think?
It's an interesting thought for sure, but I think we have to remember that diversity can also be a source of strength, even if it leads to misunderstanding sometimes.
Yeah, you're right. Okay, so now the video goes in a bit of a different direction and introduces Abraham, who's called by God to leave everything he knows behind, his home, everything, and travel to a new land that God promises to give him and all his descendants. Now that's what I call a leap of faith.
Abraham's journey is such a pivotal point in the Bible. It's the beginning of God's covenant with his chosen people, the Israelites. And it's really a story about the power of believing, trusting in something bigger than yourself, even when you don't understand the big picture. And the video explains that the sign of this covenant is circumcision.
What I find interesting is how the video doesn't shy away from Abraham being human. He's not perfect. He doesn't always know what to do. He has doubts. He makes mistakes. But ultimately, he chooses to trust in God's promise.
I think that's what makes his story so relatable, even thousands of years later. We all have moments where we have to decide if we're going to trust in something bigger than ourselves, even when it feels impossible.
It's so true, and it's so fascinating how his story continues through his descendants, Isaac, then Jacob, who, well, he has some family drama of his own with his 12 sons, which ultimately leads to.
Joseph, the ultimate underdog story. Sold into slavery by his jealous brothers, Joseph manages to rise to power in Egypt and ends up saving his family and Egypt from famine. It's a wild story of betrayal and forgiveness and ultimately God's plan.
I love how the video really captures the emotional intensity of all of that.
Mm.
The jealousy and the deception, the reconciliation at the end. I think it really resonates with our own family experiences,
Yeah.
even if we haven't been sold into slavery.
But Joseph's story is about more than just family trauma. It leads to the development of the Israelite people and them eventually leaving Egypt. And that brings us to Moses, right?
Hey, you got it. We see the Israelites enslaved in Egypt, and God calls Moses to lead them to freedom. The video really highlights just how cinematic this story could be. The plagues, the Red Sea parting, the escape. I mean, what would a modern movie of the Exodus even look like?
Well, I'm sure Hollywood would love to get their hands on those special effects, right? But the Exodus is more than just spectacle. It's a cornerstone of the Old Testament. It makes the Israelites God's chosen people, and it lays the groundwork for their laws and beliefs.
It's a story that's inspired oppressed people everywhere. It gives them hope for freedom and justice. But speaking of freedom, after escaping Egypt, they still have to get to the Promised Land. That's where Joshua takes over, and the video describes the fall of Jericho, which sounds pretty epic.
The conquest of Canaan, with Joshua leading the way, is a really complex part of biblical history. But the video acknowledges the moral questions around conquering a land that was already occupied.
Yeah, it reminds us that even in stories of victory, there are difficult questions about force and displacement.
It really challenges us to think critically about these narratives, to look at it from everyone's perspective. But the story goes on. After the conquest, we enter the period of the judges.
And this is where things start to feel like, well, a soap opera, right? The Israelites turn away from God, and God sends judges to save them from their enemies. And then it just repeats this cycle of rebellion and redemption over and over again.
The video uses this phrase, everyone did what was right in their own eyes, to describe this time, which really gets to the heart of it. When we reject guidance and do our own thing, well, it often leads to chaos and suffering.
Doesn't it, though? It makes you wonder if we're still falling into the same trap today. Choosing what we want over something bigger.
I think it's a question each of us has to ask ourselves, individually and as a society, but the story goes on from there. The Israelites decide they want a king, just like everyone else.
Here comes King Saul. He's off to a great start, but it seems like he lets the power go to his head. The video shows his fall as this classic tragedy, a leader with so much potential, but brought down by pride and not listening.
It's a warning to anyone in a position of power, isn't it? That ambition needs to be kept in check, and that staying grounded and accountable is so important.
No doubt. But then we come to David, who's described as, well, a man after God's own heart.
He's such a fascinating person. We see incredible courage when he faces Goliath, his talent as a musician, his devotion to God. But the video also shows his flaws, like his affair with Bathsheba and everything that came from that.
It's what makes him so interesting. He's not some perfect hero. He makes mistakes, struggles, but in the end, he asks for forgiveness and tries to live a life that lines up with God's will.
It reminds us that even people close to God mess up, that we're all human. But it also shows that it's possible to be forgiven, to turn things around, even after a big mistake.
And speaking of messing up, that brings us to Solomon, David's son, known for being so wise. He builds that incredible temple in Jerusalem, but then, well, he lets his wives lead him astray.
It's like his reign begins with so much promise, and yet the video shows his decline as a warning, Like even his wisdom couldn't overcome the pull of temptation.
And the consequences are huge. His actions lead to the kingdom being divided after he dies.
Exactly. It splits into Israel in the north and Judah in the south, and the video shows the different paths each kingdom takes, politically and religiously.
And it seems like neither kingdom learned from Solomon's mistakes,
Yeah.
because they both struggle with idolatry and turning away from God, even with all the prophets warning them.
The prophets are so important during this time. Elijah, Isaiah, Jeremiah, they all speak out against injustice and tell everyone to change their ways. But their message is often ignored.
That's something we see again and again in the Bible, right? Ignoring warnings, choosing the easy path instead of the right one. And then those consequences come back to bite you. And that's what happens to both of these kingdoms.
Both Israel and Judah end up exiled, away from their land and the temple. It's a devastating time. But the video shows that during this exile, the Israelites relied more on God. It's almost like they had to face their own spiritual needs because they'd lost everything familiar.
It makes sense. Sometimes you have to hit rock bottom to understand what really matters, right?
Right.
But it doesn't end there.
Thankfully, no, it doesn't. The Persians conquer Babylon, and Cyrus the Great allows the Jewish people to return to Jerusalem and rebuild their temple.
It's such a moment of hope. You can almost feel the excitement as they return home after all those years in exile.
It shows their resilience, their commitment to their faith. But even after they return, they face more challenges.
And this is where we enter the period between the Old and New Testaments, right? The intertestamental period. I feel like we often skip over this part, so I'd love to hear more about it.
It's an important time because it sets the stage for the arrival of Jesus and the start of Christianity. The Jewish people were under the rule of others, first the Greeks, then the Romans. They dealt with cultural and religious pressure, and they argued about how to stay faithful in a world that was changing.
Sounds like a time of both turmoil and anticipation. So they're living under Roman rule and trying to hold on to their identity, but at the same time, they're waiting for a Messiah, someone to save them from all this oppression.
That's exactly it. And that sense of waiting only grows as we transition to the New Testament and the birth of Jesus.
And now the video changes gears. It goes from the big picture of history to the personal story of a baby born in Bethlehem.
The video talks about Jesus' birth, emphasizing the humble circumstances. Born in a stable, but surrounded by miracles and prophecies.
It's a powerful image, isn't it? This King of Kings born in such a humble place.
It's a stark contrast that the video really brings out, and it ties everything back to the Old Testament, showing that Jesus' birth is the fulfillment of ancient promises.
It's like centuries of waiting, all led to this moment. So here's Jesus, born in Bethlehem and about to change history. But before we get into his life and ministry, I think it's time for a quick break. We'll be right back to continue this journey through the Bible in just a moment. All right, so we left off with the birth of Jesus, and now the video jumps into the period of his ministry. And let me tell you, things get pretty interesting. It focuses on moments like his baptism, that time he's tempted in the wilderness, even how he chooses his disciples, not to mention his teachings and the miracles. There's a lot going on here.
Yeah, it's important to remember the context, though, right? The Jewish people were living under Roman rule, and well, there was a lot of unrest, both social and religious unrest. And it's into this world that Jesus steps in, preaching love, forgiveness, and this coming kingdom of God.
It was radical, wasn't it, what he was teaching? He was challenging the way things were done, calling for this big shift in perspective, like a total realignment of values. Makes you wonder, how would people react today if someone came along saying those same things with the same conviction?
That's a good question. Think about it. Loving your enemies, having compassion for the poor and marginalized, putting spiritual things before material wealth. I mean, those are still radical ideas today, wouldn't you say?
Absolutely. And then you've got the miracles, too. The video shows some of the most famous ones, like when he calms the storm or feeds 5,000 people, even raising Lazarus from the dead. These aren't just stories, though, are they? They seem to be showing Jesus' power, like he has real authority. What do you think those miracles meant for the people who actually saw them?
I think they were meant to be signs pointing towards something bigger, to inspire faith and show that God's power was at work in the world. I mean, can you imagine seeing someone you know brought back to life? That would definitely change the way you understand things.
I can't even imagine. But the video also shows that not everyone was impressed by Jesus or his miracles. In fact, it seems like he had quite a few run-ins with the religious leaders of the time, the Pharisees, Sadducees, all of them. They're constantly challenging him, his authority, how he interprets the law, his claims about himself. Why do you think they were so against him?
Well, I think Jesus was a threat to their way of doing things. He didn't hold back from speaking truth to power, even when it put him in danger. And his teachings often went against their interpretation of the law and what it meant to be faithful.
So all this tension just keeps building, eventually leading to his betrayal and arrest. The video shows the Last Supper, where Jesus washes his disciples' feet and shares bread and wine with them, saying that it represents his body and blood.
It's a powerful scene, isn't it, the Last Supper? Full of symbolism. It's an act of service and humility. But it's also Jesus preparing his disciples for what's to come, his death. And then, of course, the sharing of bread and wine becomes central to Christianity later on.
And then we see Judas betraying Jesus. With a kiss, no less. It's a reminder that even those closest to you can hurt you the most.
It's such a complex part of the story, that betrayal. I think it forces us to look at ourselves, our capacity for love and betrayal. It makes you think about forgiveness, too. Redemption, I mean, can something like that even be forgiven?
That's a tough one. And the video doesn't shy away from what happens next. The trial, the crucifixion, his death and burial. It's hard to watch.
It is. The crucifixion is really the climax of the story, this moment of ultimate sacrifice. Jesus, who's innocent, takes the sins of the world upon himself. He offers himself up for everyone else. It's powerful, an image that stayed with people for centuries.
It speaks to suffering and love, to how love can change everything. But thankfully, that's not where it ends. The video then moves to the empty tomb and how Jesus appears to his followers. What are your thoughts on the resurrection?
It's the foundation of Christian faith, right? The resurrection, it changes everything. It turns despair into hope, defeat into victory, this ultimate triumph over death. And it leads to this belief in eternal life. It's incredible to think about that something so central to so many people comes from the accounts of those who claim to have seen him after he died.
It all comes down to believing, doesn't it? Believing in something you didn't actually see for yourself. But the story doesn't stop there either. The video shows Jesus ascending into heaven and then the Holy Spirit coming to his disciples on Pentecost.
It marks the end of one thing and the beginning of another, right? The ascension. It ends his time on earth, but tells his followers that it's their turn to carry on, to spread his message and build a community of believers. They even get the power of the Holy Spirit to help them.
That scene at Pentecost is wild. Tongues of fire, the disciples speaking in languages they didn't know before. It's pretty
It
intense.
really shows the birth of the church and how much energy was behind its growth early on. Now it's not just about Jesus, but this community going out into the world.
And the video shows how fast that message spread, thanks to people like Peter and Paul. But it wasn't all smooth sailing, right? The early church had to deal with persecution, disagreements within the church, and opposition from both Jewish and Roman authorities.
There were definitely struggles, both internal and external, but despite all that, the message continued to spread. Which makes you think, what was it about their faith that allowed them to keep going?
It's amazing. And speaking of compelling stories, the video mentions how Saul, who becomes Paul, converted to Christianity. What a transformation. He goes from persecuting Christians to being one of their most passionate advocates.
Paul's conversion is a huge moment for the early church. His letters become a major part of the New Testament, giving guidance and encouragement, even theological insights to Christian communities that were still growing.
And those letters become part of what will eventually be the New Testament, along with the Gospels, Acts, and letters from other apostles.
It's interesting, isn't it, to see how all those different writings show the range of thought and experience in that early church. They wrestle with theological ideas, give practical advice, and even give us glimpses into the lives of these early Christians, their challenges, and their victories.
And then you have Revelation, the final book in the Bible,
Yeah.
full of crazy imagery and apocalyptic visions. It's definitely a book that makes you think.
A lot of people see it as a book about the end of the world, but it can also be read as this message of hope, especially for those facing persecution. It tells them that even in the middle of suffering and chaos, God is in control. That ultimately, good wins over evil.
So even with all the talk of beasts and plagues and battles, there's a message of hope in there.
For sure, it encourages believers to hold on to their faith, even when things are tough, and to live their lives in a way that shows God's love and justice to everyone. But it also leaves you with this sense of, well, anticipation, like the story's not over yet.
You're so right. Even though the Bible ends with Revelation, the story of faith continues. It's alive today in the lives of those who believe. Wow, that was quite a journey. We covered so much in this deep dive, from the very beginning, creation to Revelation, from Adam and Eve all the way to Paul. The Bible really packs a lot in.
It's a huge story. History, drama, poetry, wisdom, it's all there. We saw kingdoms rise and fall, people struggling, people succeeding, and this power of faith that runs through it all, both in the stories themselves and the fact that people are still reading these stories and connecting with them today.
You know, going through all these stories, one thing that struck me is, well, how relatable they still are. They might be thousands of years old, but they're about things we still deal with today. Love, betrayal, jealousy, forgiveness, trying to figure out what it all means.
Definitely. These stories get at something essential about being human, something that goes beyond time and culture. They help us understand our relationships with each other, ourselves, and even the divine. And for people of faith, they provide a framework for making sense of the world and where they fit in.
And the video does a good job of pointing out those timeless themes, but it also doesn't shy away from the harder parts of the Bible, does it? The violence, the injustice, the suffering. How do you even begin to understand those parts of the story?
That's a question people have been wrestling with for a long time, I mean, centuries. It's important to remember that the Bible isn't just one book, right? It's a collection of writings from different times, different places, and they reflect all sorts of different views and experiences. So it's not always simple or straightforward. You'll find contradictions, complexities, even passages that can be upsetting. But for many people, trying to understand those difficult parts is, well, it's part of what makes engaging with the Bible so meaningful.
It definitely challenges you to think critically, makes you face some uncomfortable truths about humanity and the world. So after going through all of this, what stands out to you the most? What's the one thing you hope people listening take away from all this?
I think it's the hope that runs through the whole story, even when things are bad, when there's betrayal or loss. There's this thread of promise, this light that points towards something better. The rainbow after the flood, the return from exile, even the resurrection of Jesus. The Bible offers this vision of hope that people have been clinging to for thousands of years.
That's a really beautiful way to put it. And I think you're right. There are definitely some dark and difficult parts, but there's also this message of hope, of redemption. It makes you think, how do these ancient stories play out in our own lives? Where do we experience that darkness, the light, the despair, and the hope?
It is something to think about, isn't it? Maybe this deep dive gave you some new ideas or made you want to explore the Bible more on your own. Remember, it's a big book, lots of layers, lots of meaning waiting to be uncovered. There's always more to learn, more to discover, more to talk about.
Absolutely. So keep those questions coming. Keep digging deeper
Yeah.
and keep exploring the Bible. Until next time.